Hello, you lovely lot, and welcome back to a brand new video. Now, today is a very exciting one as I had the opportunity to sit down with Aisha Josiah, who is the playwright for a new stage show called Dickless, which will be premiering at the Bitesize Festival at the Riverside studio in London at the end of this month. And it was such a wonderful opportunity to sort of chat to her and speak about the show, as well as herself and the creative process and how she finds her career as a playwright. And I thought you guys would benefit from watching this as well. So I've decided to upload it here on YouTube so you can enjoy it as much as I enjoyed having the chat with her myself. Now, I will apologize. The audio is slightly all over the place as I'm working with a bit of a minimal setup at the moment. So there are moments that are slightly hard to hear, but hopefully it's enjoyable for you to watch and you learn some really interesting things, much like I did. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Flora and Aisha. Just starting off by, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the show and what people can kind of expect from it?
Oh gosh. So when you say you yourself, do you mean like talk about me or talk about like?
Yeah, no, introduce yourself just so everyone can kind of get a sense for who you are. It's all good, don't worry.
I heard you yourself, and I was like, oh yes. No, so my name is Aisha Josiah. I am half African American, half Caribbean British, and I sort of grew up in between London and New York. So I guess that explains the accent, and also just kind of, I think, not the style of plays, but sort of the voices, I guess, in my plays. A lot of them are sort of set in like imaginary places because I feel like I live somewhere in like the Mid Atlantic. So yeah, Dickless is this kind of strange little thing that came right at the end of graduation, or I say graduation. It came at the end of my final year of undergrad, and so everyone's working on their final project, and I don't think Dickless became my official submission for my degree because it was only a one act. But it was the thing that I was like, oh, maybe I can do something with this later on. Yeah, it was born out of this kind of feeling of frustration. I was feeling extremely sort of underconfident because I guess I got to the end of 4 years of art school and I'm like, oh my god, what am I doing? What is going to happen? And I think everyone gets there, but it sort of felt like you're looking out and sort of saying like, well, I've spent all this time learning how to be a playwright, but what do I do next? And so I wanted to try and recapture, I think, some of the like confidence that I'd had as a teenager. I remember distinctly being a teenager, definitely making bad decisions, but being like, this is 100% the only way. And so it was like, what happened to that person? Why am I, second guessing myself all the time and things? And in sort of looking for that, I sort of latched on to the show Misfits, which was my favorite at the time. I just love the writing, love the concepts, love the acting, and I was particularly intrigued by Kelly, who's played by I think Lauren Socha in there, and she just has this great, just like Nottingham accent that's just like super intense, and it got like all the frustration and anger and stuff out of there. And I remember she had this line like, "You do that again, I kick you so hard in the cunt, your mum will feel it." And I was like, yeah, like what? And so I just really wanted to sort of capture. It was like almost if you got the voice of someone and then you just tried to build a character and a body around them. And that's kind of, yeah, I was like, who's the kind of person that would have that essence outside of, Misfits or whatever? And then as a playwright, you're always kind of essentially writing about yourself, even when you feel like you're writing about other people. And so in hindsight, I'm like, oh yeah, that's Saff is just totally you, minus like the murders that we know of. So yeah, and it was just, I guess, this way of releasing that pent up fear and frustration, and questioning, where am I going? What am I doing? So I always sort of say, to me, Saff and Dickless as a whole feels like, I don't know if you've ever seen Mad Men,
Mm.
the opening credits, where you just have the silhouette of the guy just falling. That's basically how I felt, and that's, I think, how everyone in that play acts. They're just falling.
I think you've touched on some really interesting points there. I think particularly with me, it resonated that sort of like I'm in my last semester of university at the moment, and it is that like looking out into like Jesus, what am I gonna do? Like
Yeah.
none of my plans are in place, and so I think that's something a lot of people will definitely kind of resonate with. But this piece is being performed as part of the Bitesize Festival at the Riverside Studio, and I just wanted to ask you how important you think spaces and events like that are for sort of young creatives in terms of giving them a space where these things can be staged and shown off, because it's an incredibly hard industry to kind of break into and sort of open the door to. So yeah, just in terms of getting shows off the ground, how important do you think spaces like this are?
Yeah, I think they're incredibly important, and I think there's a little bit of a gap. I mean, there are lots of things that you can critique about the industry, but there's definitely a gap between opportunities for people who have just started, and they're like, I have never written a play before, to I'm early career, heading towards mid career, want to try new things, work at larger scales, put things in front of audiences that are more than my friends and their extended networks. And I think it can be difficult to find opportunities that are flexible enough that you can really try and potentially fail, and secure enough that you're actually interacting with the general theater going public.
Yeah.
Scratch nights are great, but one of the reasons that they're so supportive is that they're kind of they're a particular niche, right? It's kind of like, people that I know, people who know the people that I know. Everyone's super invested in, like, theater and performance.
Yeah.
They're very supportive, and I think one thing that me as a playwright, that I'm really interested in is, like, I don't necessarily want to write plays for the echo chamber, right?
Yeah.
I want the play to be genuinely interesting and exciting and moving and challenging for people who don't think like me as well. All of my characters, I would say, are kind of like come from the polar opposite, or perspective than I do. So yeah, I want to be like, who's someone that I would never meet in my network? What do they think about the play?
Yeah.
And so that's what I think opportunities like Bitesize at Riverside can do. They have such a large catchment area. They have such a large audience, but at the same time, they have that nice sort of like intimate flexibility, where they're kind of like, go try something new. So fingers crossed, there will be more of those.
No, I definitely agree. I think, well, I mean, if you've watched any of my content, you should know that I love going and seeing new theatre. And absolutely, sometimes you see stuff and you're like, okay, it wasn't for me, but I can see where the audience is for it. And other things you're like, I would have never, thought of going to see it, but actually, like, now this is my new favorite show kind of thing. And I do think these events and things like this festival are incredibly important because, like you say, it is a way of kind of broadening the horizons beyond just sort of like your mum and her mates coming to see it, and they're going to be like, oh my god, it was amazing. But sometimes you want the perspective of other people, and kind of making connections within the industry as well. But as part of that, I have to know, like, what is it like seeing a show that you've worked hard on and written sort of coming to fruition? I mean, you said you're in sort of the throes of tech week and all of that chaos, but what's it like to see something go from like idea to page and then be actually like this physical performance in front of you?
Oh, that is so. It's a roller coaster of emotions, I would say. I very quickly learned that as a playwright, you're in a sort of strange position in the rehearsal room where essentially you are like God, right? But at the same time, everyone's like, I wish God would kind of like not be here so I can like do my thing, kind of thing. And so, I think one thing that sort of going through the process of putting on productions helps you learn is like, okay, where am I needed? Where am I not needed? How do I sort of make myself available, but also not impose myself upon a production? And on the flip side of that, being able to advocate for yourself, being able to say, that's not what I meant. Or, this is a great idea, but I want to make sure, and being able to say that. I think very early in the process as a playwright, I sort of was like, I'm just so happy to be here. And like, I have no notes. So that's something I think that has just been a really interesting thing to navigate. In terms of the visceral feeling of it, I would say being in rehearsal honestly just feels like some class A drug. Like it just hits, like there's something that's, especially if you sat with characters in your head for years and years and you're like, what am I doing? Who is this person? And then you see an actor and director work to create this figment, and now it's a real person that isn't voiced by you all the time, and you're like, that's exactly what they would do. Like, of course they laugh like that. Like, and it just really, really is just so addictive. The counterpoint to that is the first performance, and really any performance. I like to say you can definitely tell who the playwright is in any given performance because it will be the person who, as soon as the lights go down, they look like they're in extreme pain. And I've seen some of my idols watch their plays live, and I had a lovely moment where I was like, is that such and such? But I can't tell if it's them. And then the lights went down. I was like, that's definitely them. Assumed just, oh God, here we go, right? And it's so funny because even though you've sat through this play a million times, every time kind of feels like, oh my God, is everyone gonna like it? Okay, is that, okay. And then learning to release and let that go, and just sort of enjoy it, I think is something I'm still trying to learn. But there's nothing like hearing an audience laugh, respond, gasp. I love a good gasp from an audience. And I think there's something very validating on an artistic level because hearing that sort of says, oh, so my experience isn't unique, right? We all live on the same planet. We are living life together. We have shared experiences. Okay, great. This isn't all a figment of my imagination, which is, it solves some nice existential angst. So yeah, it's a real roller coaster, but definitely a drug. If I could bottle it, like this would be, it would knock heroin out of the park.
I was gonna say, I think there'd be a big market for that.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
But no, I think, yeah, it's partly what I love about theatre is the fact that you can fill an auditorium with people and we're all there connecting with the same story. And yeah, it must be, particularly if there is a very big element of you within everything you write, to be able to sit there and people are laughing at the right moments and gasping at the right moments. You're going, yes, it's not like I'm not crazy. People are relating to this. That must be like, well, you said it's like a drug, completely sort of unbelievable. But you sort of touched on a few of your idols. Is there anyone in particular that sort of has really inspired you as a writer? You obviously talked about sort of misfits and things like that, but are there any sort of pieces of work that you look at and kind of went, that was what made me want to sort of get into this?
Oh yeah. Gosh, you know, and writing, being a woman of color, I'm very aware that a lot of my idols are straight white men, and I'm like, interesting. I'll unpack that later. But yeah, I would say first and foremost, David Mamet. I think I was introduced to him pretty early after I think Sam Shepard, who was the first sort of like playwright that I latched onto, but I didn't. Our experiences didn't really mesh, and not that my experiences with David, like mine and Dave Mamet's experiences meshed at all. But he was the first playwright that sort of like lit up this thing in my brain. And I was like, oh, how did he do that? And I think I describe his plays as sort of feeling like impressionist paintings to me. It's these little dabs of dialogue, but if you look at it, you're like, that's not dialogue. I mean, that's not a conversation. That's just these are just words. But when you step back, it creates this incredible mosaic that is so detailed. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I need to learn how to do this. At the same time, I was like, whoa, what kind of women have you met? Like, there's so much here. Why? And so, it became this real tussle of like, I love and hate your plays. And I sort of got into this thing of I just need to keep writing. Like I would literally copy out sections of plays that I liked. Just to I say like with a pen, it was actually on a computer, but like just to sort of get the feeling of like what's going on here. And so I've done a fair few of David Mamet's plays, and I'm like, okay. And I think he is primarily the person that taught me rhythm. I think Aaron Sorkin is another one. Just rhythmically, I could like close my eyes. It's like listening to a symphony. Just like, oh man, like you know what you're doing. And I also love that he has this sort of very, uh, I don't know, very sweet, like almost like a person who like reads romance novels, right? Everything's super cynical, but then also there's like a little love story. And so that's kind of what I used to find it annoying actually. I used to be like, oh, here we go, but it's kind of redeeming in a way. David Ireland, who I was introduced to through Cypress. Is it Cypress Avenue? I can't remember. Just lovely and dark, and just kind of. I love how in your face and yet subtly in your face it is. Just really, really love that. And same with Martin McDonough, which is significantly more like less, in your face, less subtle, not afraid to sort of make those dark jokes and be like, so what? So yeah, on the flip side, Sarah Kane, just the audacity that comes off the page there. Sarah Rule, um, audacious, but in a sort of like a subtle way. The vibrator play is still in the next room. I love how I ignore in the next room. I just call it the vibrator play because that's the important play.
Of course.
So beautiful, so beautifully written. And Susan Laurie Parks. Just again, I think playwrights with rhythms that feel outside of naturalism and yet somehow create a naturalistic effect. That's something that I find really intriguing. Susan Laurie Parks does that incredibly well. And also just is not afraid to just go in the complete, like, this isn't naturalistic at all. Let's go on this ride. So yeah, gosh, there's never enough time. There's never enough plays, but those are kind of like the ones that I keep going back to again and again.
No, I love that. I think it's very interesting that you sort of touched on the fact that a lot of sort of the playwrights originally are kind of like, upper class white men. And how important do you think it is to sort of see people like yourself like reflected in the sort of arts landscape in the UK? Because it is still sadly an incredibly male and white dominated industry.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting from a writing perspective and from a career perspective because invariably, I think when you're learning any new sort of artistic pursuit, a lot of your time is spent mimicking, right? You're trying to figure out, like, how did they do that? How do I do it? And it's that sort of like gap between, what they're able to achieve and what you're able to achieve, where you see, okay, this is what makes me me.
Yeah.
And I think while you can not easily, but while you can teach while you can teach form, I should say, we can teach how to, do non-naturalistic dialogue or how to, layer metaphors and things like that. It is You cannot teach content and perspective, right? And invariably, I think you get to a point, and I got to a point where I would read these plays and go, I don't understand these people. Like, I understand the play, I
Yeah.
understand what's happening. I do not understand why this character does this, right? Chekhov, like, Three Sisters. Go, go then.
Yeah.
Just go. And it sounds trite because at the same time you're kind of like, of course not. And there's so many ways in which, like, there are places in our lives where we feel like, the answer is simple and yet not simple. But for me, it wasn't the sort of like, growing up in a large country house in, Victorian period, or and sort of, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my day. I don't have that as, a personal experience or as a historical familial experience. However, with enough imagination, you can sort of make a connection between, oh, okay, but that kind of feels a little similar to, being Caribbean abroad, right? Like, where do I belong? Can I go home? Where is home? Right? Or if, we're talking about power and betrayal and things like that, I don't understand necessarily what it feels to be like a man navigating, real estate in the 1980s. But I do know how it feels in women's spaces to kind of say, are you working with me or against me? Right? And how do I manage that? Um, and then when you step back, you sort of say, oh, all these plays that I've grown up with, the canon, they are great, but they're not interested in me. They're not interested in my experience. And so they don't reflect that. And when they do attempt to, it's not right. You know, it's kind of like, oh, yes, I see what you're doing there. It's oh God, it's Save the Last Dance. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, I see they're doing the hip hop now. And so what's exciting, I think, about being what's exciting about realizing, oh, I've got a new perspective, is that I can now play with those skills that I admire and sort of say, all right, but what if this power play isn't about, we're all after some guy, right? What if this anti-hero or this villain is allowed to be female and there's no, you know, like there's no rhyme or reason to her that has anything to do with being jilted by a lover, right? Because that's where it all comes down to. It's like
Yeah.
she's always upset about some guy, because that's not how I live my life. But I can definitely point out some people who are just like, I would not cross her. She's crazy, you know. And so just exploring that. There's a cynical aspect to it as well, because if you use forms that are recognizable, then you can sort of slip in under the radar, because sort of people say, oh, that's a play that I recognize. Oh, saying something interesting. We'll let that slide. All right. I think one thing I thought that was unexpected for me was that there's an expectation, though, as well, from the other side, from agents, from venues, from even from actors and other writers, that I will have preoccupations with certain themes, um, which can be limiting as well, right? Because on the one hand, I'm like, oh, I should be writing more about these themes because, of course, like I have a platform. I can, this is I can represent. Um, but that's a kind of pressure that I feel like someone like Aaron Sorkin or David Mamet doesn't have, right? Like they're not like, oh God, I have to speak for white men today, right? And they're like, no, I speak for this character. And so that's something that I'm always pushing against. I'm like, I speak for these characters, and they're informed by my experience, and that's great. But that's something that I hold on to fiercely, because there's a lot of effort to sort of push you into a box and be like, oh, what are you saying about the community? So
No, that's definitely an angle I wouldn't have considered before, that almost sort of like everything you write must sort of have these undertones because of who you are as a writer, when actually you're right. I mean, Shakespeare wasn't making grand political statements. He was just writing. And why can't you do the same just because you're not a
right.
white man? What advice do you have for people, whether they're sort of looking at maybe going to school for playwriting, or they're maybe sort of in a position like you were not that long ago and sort of about to be turfed out into the world and sort of said, go and, make your own way? What kind of, because I imagine it's quite difficult, right? Like you've got something that you love and you're trying to get it to gain traction and things like that. But like, what advice do you have in terms of people sort of getting started and how to kind of persevere through all of the ups and downs of a career as a playwright?
That's a really good question. I think um, there is a lot of sort of myth and legend wrapped up in the idea of not just playwriting but making art generally. And I would say that the sooner and the more completely you can sort of drop that, right? Like, this idea that, like, this is the only thing I was born to do on the planet, and it's like, I just can't do anything else. And it's like, there's no way to prove that. And also, you probably can do some other stuff if you practice, right? But you want to do this. So a more useful question is, why do I want to do this? What do I want to achieve from this? Um, and asking that as on a grand level for a career, but also on a granular level for work, right? Why do I want to write this thing? Why am I spending my time with these people? There have been times when I've been writing something and I'm like, what am I doing with this? I don't want to spend time with this.
Yeah.
Like, and you can stop and you can just go and do something different. So I think that is, um, in a way of saying, don't take yourself too seriously. But the caveat to that is, take the time to learn the skills and the time to create seriously. I think the biggest thing that I struggle with is just creating time and sort of allowing myself to sit in that uncomfortable space of, I don't know quite what I'm doing here, but I'm going to do it anyway. which is essentially the process of making anything, good. Like if you know exactly what you're doing from the outset, then there's no point in writing this play. And if you are willing to sort of invest the time and energy into really figuring out, like, what is this play trying to say? What are these people saying to me? Why do I want to write it? Then it can be such a fulfilling experience. And I would say getting your work into a rehearsal room, getting it in front of people who are going to like work on it, is probably one of the best ways of learning, because it's engaging all of your senses, and it allows you to see that there are infinite ways that this play could have been written. You've chosen this way, so why did you do that?
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes you might go, oh, now that I think about it, I should have just done it that way, and you can change it, and that's great. But it's like it's a really kind of, I find it kind of like a spiritual process. Like I'm kind of like, oh yeah, like I exist and I can have an effect on the world, and I can create worlds and destroy them, and choose paths and change them, and and it gives you a sense of um, I don't quite know what to call it, but there's it feels, it gives me a sense of contentment, I think, to sort of know, all right, if I want to do it, I can. And that's kind of what I love most about it. Yeah, I would say consistency. If I had to boil it down to one thing, find a practice that you can stick to. Um, Even if it doesn't look like what it says in the books, even if it's not like, get up at 6 in the morning and like do your 100 pages and whatever, if your consistency is like every time I hear, or every time like I hit, 4:30, I write 5 minutes or whatever. If that's what works for you and you do it every day, good. That's it. If There's nothing beyond that. It's if you want to write, if you want to be a writer, you have to write,
Yeah.
right? But no one else can tell you how to write. And I find that a lot of the traditional advice, I mean, it's all written by white men. But it kind of assumes like, okay, here's how to make writing as close to a 9 to 5 job as possible.
Yeah.
Which is really restrictive, right? Who said that to write something you have to sit down at a desk? Who said that to write something you have to, have a piece of paper, or have a computer in front of you? Some of the best stuff that I've done has just been dictation, and dictation in little short bursts of like 2, 3 minutes, right? Sometimes it'll just be asking myself questions, answering those questions, asking them again. Eventually, you do get down to, okay, what's the dialogue? What's the plot? What's the character? But there are so many avenues to get there, that it can be restrictive to sort of say, what's the best way to write a play, So I don't know if that helps. Gosh.
No, I think it's definitely, I love that you touched on the fact that it's not a linear process, which I think unfortunately a lot of people, let's be real, are exposed to sort of plays and theatre through like GCSE English, in which they're like, we're going to read Shakespeare and you're going to analyze like every word as if it's got some, like, I'm imagining when you're sitting down and writing something like Dickless, you're not like, when this character says this, it's got this like deep hidden under meaning, and all, like, sometimes it is like that's just what they're feeling and they are saying it to you. And I think, yeah, the fact you touched on all of these different avenues in terms of like, you don't have to sit down for 2 hours and write a whole script. Asking yourself questions about the characters and their motives and your motives, I think really helps kind of make it a bit more of a holistic process, as opposed to just you are going to sit down and write a play and that will make you a playwright. But yeah, I think I'm just double checking I've not left any questions out. But this has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you for taking the time to sit down and
no worries.
and
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's always great to sort of talk to people about what's going on in your head. As just writing, you spend a lot of time by yourself, and you're like, I wonder if anyone else is thinking about this, or if it's just me.
No, absolutely. And then I'm just going to reiterate it so everyone that ends up watching this on YouTube, or I'm probably going to end up putting little clips on TikTok as well, just to help spread the word. This piece will be, it's called Dickless, and it will be at the Bitesize Festival at the Riverside studio in London from the 30th of January to the 3rd of February. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely correct.
Double checking I got my dates right, because sometimes I'm like, I say something and then there's like a little edit in the video being like, I've got this completely wrong. So I'm glad I got that right. But yeah, do you have any sort of like closing thoughts or feelings you'd like to sort of share with anyone?
I would just say if you've got the impulse to do it, as whether that's playwriting or acting or whatever, I don't think you need anything more than why not as a reason. Why not? Just do it.
Exactly.
And it doesn't need to be any more profound than that. I want to. Let's do it. So I don't know if that's helpful to anyone, but I know I spent a lot of hours when I was a playwriting student being like, why am I doing this? When is the ray of light going to come down and say, yes, you are playwright.
This divine intervention. No.
Doesn't happen. Unless you kick that up yourself, in which case, kudos to you. But yeah, you don't need it. You don't need it. You don't even need a strong sense that this is something that you were born to do or that you're super good at or whatever. You just want to do it. So do it.
No, I think that is the perfect sentiment. That is my like mindset for 2024. It's like, why not? Give it a try. The absolute worst that can happen is you either decide you don't like it, or you find something else you like more. Like at the end of the day, and I think that is, yeah, I think particularly for the creative industry, I think we need a lot more why not, because it's how we end up getting interesting and new perspectives across, instead of like, well, I mean, my followers are sick of me talking about the fact that every new musical is just a reskinning of like a 90s or 2000s film, and I'm like,
this is a conversation that needs a glass of wine, because I'm like, the number of mashups that I think would make amazing musicals. Oh my God. I have one that's been in my head for years. So Django Unchained, When Harry Met Sally.
That would be amazing.
When Django Met Sally. You're like, what is happening, right? But also genius.
That would be so good. Oh my goodness. Well, if you ever make that happen, someone that will be in the audience cheering you on.
Right? Just like, this is insane.
Oh, that's absolutely amazing.
But yeah, no, I think you're right. It's like, instead of trying to find a thing that is, right, like, I wish that when you write funding bids and things like that, you could really just end them with like, why not?
Yeah.
I want money for this because why not?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that's perfect. And I think, yeah, definitely an attitude I'd like to see more sort of in the industry in general, just in terms of putting new people on stage and putting new pieces on stage as well. And so hopefully little events like the Bitesize Festival are kind of how that all starts to happen. But I wish you the best of luck with your performances. I hope this sort of tech week and final rehearsals aren't, too stressful for you, although I know they always inevitably end up being. And yeah, I actually cannot wait to see sort of the future of Dickless and yourself as a playwright. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.